I wanted to welcome everybody today to, this is sort of a double whammy. This is one of Kowa Sporting Optics events that we do each Saturday, our live webinars, and we're hosting with Alvaro Jaramillo today, the author of Birds of Chile, New World Blackbirds, countless articles, tons of stuff. A guy that I thought was going to be a lot older than he was when I first met him years ago.
I'm a lot older now.
Yeah. This is what I expected 20 years ago when we met, whenever it was. At any rate, just a quick bit of business. We're also live streaming as part of the biggest week in American birdings and Time and Optics Virtual Optics Alley. So we're being live streamed over there as well. I just wanted to tell everybody to remind everybody, for those that are here as part of the Optics Alley, we're doing this again as part of our biggest week celebration. Normally we'd be up in Ohio at that event, working with our vendor Time and Optics, selling optics. With that canceled, like everything else in the world, we are doing a virtual event. So for those that are here with Time and Optics, I want to let you know to go and you can check out for special pricing on some of the products that we have available, as we would have at the actual event. It's shoptimeandoptics.com, and more importantly, 5% of every purchase does indeed get forwarded over to the Black Swamp Bird Observatory to support their research and conservation efforts. And that's the real important thing I wanted to talk about. But with no further ado, I'm going to just drop into darkness and leave it to Alvaro Jaramillo.
Okay.
Thanks, Al.
All right, no problem. Hey, thanks everybody for tuning in and wanting to find out a little bit more about pelagic birding, especially in California and the West Coast. I'm going to talk a little bit too about further south in Chile towards the end, but give you an introduction to pelagic birding, some of the birds we see, how it works, and what the boats look like and so forth. So we're just sort of get going right here, and there's you can ask questions on this forum, as well as there's a Facebook set of questions that we can deal with maybe at the end. If something comes up that just looks really sort of specific to that what we're talking about right there and then, we might just try to answer it right away. But let's just get going here and show you a bit about what this pelagic birding is all about. So one of the things you've got to think about is we live on planet Earth, but planet Earth is really mostly water. So when you're birding most of the time in the land-based part of our planet, and you're missing most of the planet. Most of it is water. And that's what we're talking about here, is birds that are out in the offshore realm of the Earth. So this is what most of your world looks like. And how many of you have actually seen that, where you can't see the coast any side of you? It's few of us, actually. The other thing is to sort of separate the idea of a seabird versus a pelagic bird, what all this means. This is a ring-billed gull. A ring-billed gull is found all over North America, for example. You can see them in right in the center of Canada and the US. And it's a seabird in that it's some places you can see them on the coast, and you might be able to see them a few miles offshore. But it is not a pelagic bird. When we're talking about pelagic birds, we're talking about those species that are offshore that you will have a hard time seeing unless you're well out in the ocean. Sabin's gull here on a fork-tailed storm petrel. You can see Sabin's gulls if you go to the Arctic, but most people probably see them offshore on a pelagic trip. Hard pressed to see a fork-tailed storm petrel other than on a boat trip, pelagic trip, because where they go to nest, they nest in these islands up north, hard to get to, and they come in at night. So if you want to see a fork-tailed storm petrel, you need to go on a pelagic birding trip. Now, this picture here of the world with all of these colors, each one of these is a different project that's tracking a seabird. And they put it all together to show you how these ocean birds really, are found all over the world's oceans. Really sort of even in the middle of the ocean, there are some of these seabirds out there. So the world is really full of seabirds, although in many places when you go out offshore, the densities are quite low. So it all depends. And fortunately, California and the west coast of South America have high densities of seabirds. So they're really great places to go pelagic birding. In fact, often it's the west coast of continents that have all of the seabird densities. This is the kind of boat we would use out of Half Moon Bay. This is the new Captain Pete, one of the boats that we charter to go seabirding. It's about 53 feet long, so we're talking 15 meters or so, and you will take 20 to 30 people on a trip like this. And they all the seabird birders, on the West Coast charter fishing boats to go do their trips. So at least on the Pacific, none of the birders own their own boats. So that means that there'll be different boats depending on where you're going, what you're doing. And this is a map of what a trail of a seabird pelagic birding trip might look like, starting in Half Moon Bay over on the coast on the right there. And we'll head out over this flat shelf, and I'll talk to you about this a little bit later, for a couple of hours of just travel where you're in water that isn't that deep. In fact, it's about 300 feet deep, 100 meters or so, until you get to where it really drops off these canyons, Pioneer Canyon, and what we call the continental shelf edge, where water becomes really deep, and you're then truly in the marine pelagic realm. And it does take a couple of hours to get there. So you're talking about these trips being a full day trip of 8 to 10 hours. Some of them even go to 12 hours, depending on what you're trying to see, what you're trying to do. And you will gauge what you do, where you go, depending on the conditions that are out there. But this is the kind of thing that happens. You go and meander, look for concentrations. Here, we actually saw Manx shearwater halfway through. That little spot there says Manx. Found Scripps' Merlet just offshore from the continental shelf edge. Laysan albatross. Pretty good day, actually. Pretty good day. And then on our way back, also a stone petrel flock, and another Scripps' Merlet. And then we sort of, there's a point in time where you just got to get home and the line becomes straight. You're just heading back to the barn. And one of the things that people ask, especially if they've never been on one, how you do this, and specifically how you avoid getting seasick, because seasickness can happen. It's one of those things that can happen to anybody, even people who've been out there forever. There's a certain day that suddenly, it's my day. Other people it never happens. And then there's some poor souls where, they see the water and they get seasick. So it's a personal type of, variation that happens, but there are some things you can do to help yourself out. One of them is to get good amount of sleep beforehand. And this can be tough because people are really excited. They can't get to sleep because next day they're going to go see albatrosses, but prioritize getting sleep. I would say celebrate after the pelagic, not before. So unless you've been out there forever and you know what it's like, don't, avoid alcohol the night before. While you're on the trip, eat. I like to have crackers. Some people like to have ginger snaps or various other things, even that you can just sort of have your stomach working on something throughout the trip. Some people don't like to eat anything on a boat trip. That would be bad for me. I need to munch on something. Drink water, sunscreen. Even in situations where there's, a lot of cloud layer, you can get sunburn, especially if you're out there for hours and you're trying to, you're outside. So most of the time. So also stay outside. Try to avoid going into the cabin, because the cabin is where a lot of people sometimes, get sort of start feeling a little odd when you can't see the horizon. Look at the horizon. That's important. And also concentrate on the fact that you're seeing all these birds, whales, and things that are happening. Concentrate on what you're seeing and enjoy what you're seeing, and your mind will actually go to that rather than focusing in on the fact that you sort of feel a little weird. You know, without sounding dismissive, seasickness is not in your head, it's real, but your head can make it worse. So if you're like worried about it, it can happen. If you are actually relaxed about it and then you're focusing on other things and thinking positively that you're going to have a great time, nothing's going to happen to you, more likely than not, you won't get seasick. But you know, there's the physiology that takes precedence over any of that. And if in doubt, if it's your first time, you don't want to sort of have it be an unknown. Take medication. There's over-the-counter, there's prescription medication. You can talk to your doctor about all that. Read online about the medications available for seasickness. The conditions. I often will get that question of, well, when is it good to go out there? And it just depends day to day, even hour to hour, it can change. If the wind picks up and it can go from being flat calm to choppy. So keep that in mind. You just never know. You have to really sort of be out there and see what it's like, or at least have the buoy data that's coming in to know what it's like at that present moment. This boat, the Huli Cat, that's actually riding that massive wave, that is a real photo. It's not on a birding trip. We will never do that on a birding trip, but that's when they were filming a movie called Chasing Mavericks. And the boat, as it was filming, got into a situation where it rode this massive wave called Mavericks. And you want to avoid that, let's put it that way. But what you're dealing with out there in terms of weather is wind, the swell are sort of the ocean waves, and swells can be really big and you might not feel them out there if they're well spaced. That's the swell period. And all of this varies day to day. You can have a big swell, well spaced, and you'll have a comfortable ride. You can have a wind pick up, 10 extra knots and suddenly becomes choppy. So all of these things are things you might want to talk about with, the tour operator, and also know when things are canceled. Usually boat trips are canceled when the captain decides that it's not safe and doesn't want to go out there and put anybody at risk. So the captain makes the call. It's not the birders that make the call. So there's a lot of variables, and sometimes, So I've had people come to me and say, oh my God, there's a 12-foot swell out there. We can't go out there. We go out there and it's flat calm because the 12-foot swell is so widely spaced, you can't even feel it. But why do you do this, right? You go out to see these birds like black-footed albatross, which is the most common of our albatrosses in California. And you've got to get out beyond the continental shelf. You have to do those 2 hours of driving out there to get into the potential for seeing black-footed albatross. And here in this map, you see that red color there? That's the coast of Western North America from British Columbia down into Southern California. And the red is where the highest concentration of marked black-footed albatrosses are found. So these are satellite tag birds. And you'll see that right there, we're in the middle of that where it says Gulf of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. That's roughly where we are in Half Moon Bay. And this stretches from Cordell Bank, which is an area that boat trips go out of, called Bodega Bay, down to Monterey Bay, which is another well-known birding destination for pelagics. And we do trips out of all of those, as well as Morro Bay down south. Laysan albatross is the other albatross we might go and get to see out there, and they're becoming more common, which is really interesting. They nest in Central Pacific and over, on the Western Pacific, but there's also this little colony of them in Guadalupe Island in Mexico. And that colony is growing, and most of the birds are banded with these red bands that have numbers on them. And most of the Laysan albatrosses we see now have bands from Mexico. So we're seeing this growing population of birds from Mexico. And if Laysan albatrosses strikes a chord, you've heard about them before. Wisdom is the oldest known bird on Earth at 69 years old, and she's a Laysan albatross, banded by famous ornithologist Chandler Robbins, who passed away a few years ago. So these are really neat birds, long-lived, they roam around all over the ocean, and your chance of seeing them in many cases, unless you're going to a breeding colony, is to get out on a pelagic trip to see them. Now, one of the things that really gets people going is rare birds. You know, on our very first pelagic trip that we did out of Half Moon Bay, in a period of time where there were no trips that went out of Half Moon Bay, the very first trip we saw a super rare bird, a short-tailed albatross. This is the individual here with what it looks like, you know, sort of like a robotic individual with all this electronics in the back. It was a bird that was being satellite tracked from a project in Japan, because in Japan, this species had basically gone extinct after World War II through the feather trade, various other things. But now they're really increasing in numbers. So we've got over 1,000 now in the world, and it looks like a big version of the black-footed albatross with this sort of beautiful pink bill with a blue tip. And it turns out that this individual, Y18, was part of a project where they'd moved some babies from one island to establish a secondary breeding island in Mukojima. And we were able to see its southernmost extension of its movement right across the entire ocean. When it got to California, got to Half Moon Bay, we saw it. It turned around and started going back north again. And that picture there you see of the bird fledging is Y18, the day that she fledged from the nest. So we suddenly, you know, we're part of this really impressive story. We actually, our photographs of our bird were on the news in Japan and so forth. We became famous in Japan for a day. And it was just really neat to see a rare bird that also was part of a project that was, you're trying to preserve this bird. And we had a little tidbit of you know, aiding in the information gathering for that situation. As well as it being our first pelagic trip out of Half Moon Bay. That sealed the deal for us, that this was a great place to go out birding from. So we've been doing them ever since. And, you know, staying on the idea of rare birds, North America's first Salvin's albatross showed up in July 2014, a bird we found, and we were able to spend over an hour with it. So that was wonderful. We've seen first California white-chinned petrel, wedge, you know, tailed shearwaters, great shearwaters, all sorts of rare birds, but also we see the common birds, and the common birds for a lot of people are the ones that we may get used to because we go there all the time, but in fact, you know, are not common if you live in Kansas, let's say. You know, these are the birds that are sort of the bread and butter birds. Are amazing. People sometimes also ask me, do I have dreams of what could show up? And this is the bird I really dream about showing up in California, and it's the northern royal albatross, one of the big great albatrosses. And hopefully it'll happen. You know, it keeps you sort of excited to think that any day you go out there, something really fantastic that is completely not even on the books could happen. And that's one of the magic bits about pelagic birding and why some people get hooked on it. Really, it's just you just never know what you're going to see. But I wanted to just also give you an idea of how impressive these birds are and some of the research that's going on with them. In almost this is sort of an imaginary thing. You almost have to close your eyes and think about this. But there are wandering albatrosses that are being tracked from South Georgia Island that have all sorts of gadgetry that measure the temperatures, what they're feeding, what they're doing, how they're moving, and so forth. And they can sense when an albatross has eaten something by the temperature of their stomach. When the temperature goes down, it means they just ate something cold, which that means, you know, it's a squid or something that they ate. So they have these birds that are being tracked, and there are some birds, these albatrosses, that in the middle of the night, okay, so nobody has seen this. This is just an idea of what might be happening. They sit on the ocean, and they're moving in tight circles, just tight circles. They're sitting on the water, and every so often, they eat something. They get food, and you know, the ocean is, food doesn't come to you in the ocean. You usually have to chase food. So this is really a mystery. And what people think might be happening, and one day we'll know, you know, one day we'll be able to have this on video or something. But I think it's just magical to think that it could be a possibility, is that these albatrosses land on the water and they start pattering in order to get bioluminescence, sort of that, you know, natural, these creatures and bacteria that create light when you mess around with them. They create a bioluminescent ball at night, and squid come up to look at this ball of light and then the albatross eat the squid. Can you imagine? This is amazing. I want to see this on video one day. But just the idea that this is possible also, allows me sometimes to think that seabirds might be some of the coolest, most interesting birds on Earth. California is special for seabirds because I told you we have that flat area, then we can get out to deep water really, relatively soon, and some of it's super deep, especially if you go down south and this picture to Monterey Bay Canyon, where there's deep water just a few miles from shore. And there are, ridges and valleys in that creates situations where water sort of moves around and creates turbulence and so forth that can bring in food towards the surface. We have the California current, which is like a conveyor belt of cold, nutrient-rich water that comes southward along the California coast, created by all these gyres in the ocean. We have upwelling. Upwelling is when wind pushes in a directional manner, pushes the water out of the way, the surface water, and you get bottom nutrient-rich water coming up towards the sun, and that is food. That nutrient-rich water creates all the a plankton bloom and so forth that eventually actually storm petrels will feed on. So we have the currents and upwelling, which are separate, different things that create food. We also have islands for the birds to nest in, like the Farallon Islands here, or the Channel Islands over towards the right side of this picture. We also have regimes of water that changes from colder water to warmer water. We've, in fact, been able to detect that we have these decade-long cycles where water can get colder, and then anchovy becomes the most common, small fish, versus when it gets warmer, and sardines become the big, the more common fish. So we have all these variations too. And in the current world, we also can download data from satellites that shows us stuff like on the left here, that color that's more orangey and red is warm water. The blue is cold water. So we can go to areas where the cold and the hot meet, and those are really great spots. It's like going to an edge of a field and a forest. Those are areas where two different habitats in the ocean come together. And on the right, this is chlorophyll. This is where food is happening. We can then gauge what areas have water with a lot of chlorophyll versus less, and that can change what kind of species you might be able to find. If you're want to see sooty shearwaters, you want to go to a place that has a lot of chlorophyll because they need densities of food. And introducing you to the seabirds in California, I'll just, we've talked about albatrosses, the shearwater, storm petrels, the alcids, skuas, gulls and terns, phalaropes. I'll just show you a few of these, give you an idea of what they look like. This is the most common shearwater in California, the sooty shearwater. It's all dark with sort of a pale silvery area under the wing. And these are birds that concentrate when there's a lot of food. They need densities of what we call bait or bait fish, and some of it isn't even fish, like squid. So anchovy, sardines, squid, krill, anything that's found in high densities, that's where common murres are going to be found and where sooty shearwaters are going to be found. And they just need huge abundance. It's the same kind of stuff that the whales, humpback whales, come to eat. And when you see in July, August, sometimes the high numbers of sooties, it can be just impressive. Thousands, tens of thousands. I'm not going to play this video. Maybe later we can play it. But you see, this is just looking out from the ocean near my house here. And all those little black dots in the water are sooty shearwaters. There were hundreds of thousands of sooty shearwaters that day, and they were right off the beach. And they were eating masses, millions of anchovy that day. So they require these densities. One colony in Chile on Isla Guafo has over 4 million sooty shearwaters. So these are common birds. And then it's a map of sooty shearwaters being tracked from New Zealand breeding colonies. You see that they cover the entire Pacific in a figure-8 pattern, but there are areas of concentration, like Japan, Russia, the Aleutians, and that coast from British Columbia down to Baja California, where we are, that are really good sooty shearwater hotspots. And all of those places are places where there's a lot of food. Other shearwaters we can see, include birds that have white bellies and are bigger than the sooty shearwater, like the pink-footed here on the left that breeds in Chile, or the beautiful buller shearwater that breeds in New Zealand, and has a very sleek looking and really pretty shearwater with this black and gray pattern. They're a little bit odd in that they come in late in the season, and some years we see a lot more of them than in other years, and it depends on us getting a lot more warmer water. Pink-footed shearwater is a standard bird that comes in every year. Black-vented shearwater here on the left is one that breeds in Mexico, so it's actually the closest breeding species of shearwater to us, but it's one of the most irregular because it depends on warm water. So if we have warm water that year, we'll see black vents. If we don't have warm water, they may just get to Monterey and not go any further north. Northern fulmars breed in the north, so in Alaska, British Columbia, and then fly south. So they're more common in winter. We don't do many trips in winter. Most of the trips we do are July to October, but there's always some fulmars around. They're around year round. The storm petrels are little guys, like just sort of bigger than the swallow, sort of like a sturdy swallow, but they're hard to see because they fly close to the water and get lost, behind the waves and so forth. We have fork-tailed storm petrels. In this case, here you have an ashy storm petrel on the left and Wilson storm petrel on the right with the white rump. Ashy is sort of gray with pale on the underwing. Maybe that's a fork-tailed. Well, I don't know. I have to look at the original photo of that. I think it's actually an ashy. It's just overexposed. The odd thing is that people have looked at the genetics now and found that storm petrels are two different families of birds. So the Wilsons is actually now not considered the same family as the ashy or the leech is, for example. And one of the things about California is it was historically known for these areas where you could get flocks of storm petrels, of many ashies and blacks and forktails, especially in Monterey Bay. That doesn't occur anymore in Monterey Bay. The flocks have shifted north. So now, if the flocks form, they form in Half Moon Bay or Bodega Bay at Cordell Bank, but not in Monterey anymore. And that's a big mystery. Why something that was so regular and so standard just suddenly shifted for some reason. But here's a mixed flock of ashy and forktails. Here's an ashy and a black storm petrel. The black's on the right. He's bigger and darker, doesn't have any pale on the underwing. And I point out here that water temperature has a real influence on what you see. And you'd never know what the water temperature is going to be on any one year. You sort of have to repeat, come back. If you happen to be there during a cold water season, you may not see black storm petrels that year. They need warm water. Or you might want to go to Southern California or elsewhere where the water's warmer to try to increase your chances of seeing a black storm petrel. Yet other years, they're really common. They can be the most common storm petrel. So water temperature influences. Alcids are, only found in the Northern Hemisphere. And we have a real good diversity of alcids in California. Sort of the star of the show is a tufted puffin that breeds in the Farallon Islands that are only about 30 miles from Half Moon Bay, San Francisco. And several hundred breed there. And we do trips to go see puffins in the breeding areas in July, August. But you can see puffins and non-breeding puffins throughout the fall elsewhere. So you just never know that with puffins, they're not that common. So you just have to, find one randomly out sitting on the ocean. We, with common murres, we often get the situation of a common murre sick on the beach. And some people will say, I saw a penguin. Of course, we don't have penguins in the Northern Hemisphere. And, most birders will say, well, no, you're wrong. You didn't see a penguin. We don't have penguins, it's a murre. But I want to tell you something. The alcid that's extinct, the great auk from the East Coast, Newfoundland to Iceland, the great auk was originally known as the penguin. It is the bird that actually was the penguin. And when sailors found penguins in the Southern Hemisphere, they misused the name, transferred it to another group of birds, and they became the penguins. So originally, alcids were penguins. So in a sense, when that lady says, or that person says to you, I saw a penguin on the beach, they're kind of right, they're kind of wrong. So it all depends on how you look at it. Common murres, though, are a really abundant breeder on the Farallon Islands and all the way up into Alaska and so forth. 300,000 individuals roughly breed on the Farallones, which is not too far away from Half Bay, San Francisco. Masses of them. We get to see them in non-breeding plumages with the white and the teardrop dark coming back behind the eye, to the dark-headed breeding individuals. They always have white flanks with sort of dark stripes on them. And they have an interesting breeding situation in that the young fledge from the nest before they can actually fly. It's safer for them to go to the ocean rather than to stick around on an island full of western gulls and predators that can get to them. So the little chicks dive into the ocean from these cliffs, and then they listen for their father. And they will follow their father on the water and swim sometimes 30, 40, 50 kilometers away, just swimming and eating until they can fly. So they get away from the island as fast as they can. It's not uncommon to see these little guys, just little puffballs following the adults around when you head out in August, late July, and so forth, that time of year. Other alcids include the Katzensauglet, which is a real little, small, dark bird that if it's available, they love krill. Krill is the food that they really specialize on, and they will do best in breeding seasons when there's a lot of krill. And if you see masses of Katzensauglet, you will often also find blue whales in that area. So blue whales and Katzensauglet go together. And we're actually in a really good area to see blue whales. But again, it varies year to year. It depends on if the food is here or it's not here. So when sometimes people say, well, I see a blue whale, you could, but you can't predict any of this. And that's part of what makes birding offshore frustrating, is it's unpredictable, but it's also what makes it fantastic, because it's unpredictable. And when we're heading out, we look for marble murrelets, little alcids that actually nest in trees. This is the last species of bird in North America to have, or regularly occurring bird, to have its nest found, because nobody thought a seabird was nesting inland in old growth forest. And their dependency, at least where we are, on old growth forest is one of the reasons they're so uncommon. So they're an endangered species. Pigeon guillemots breed in the harbors and are beautiful with these black birds with bright red feet. And if they open their mouth, they have these bright red insides of the mouth. So we'll see them in most of the trips until about first week of September. Then they migrate. And weirdly enough, pigeon guillemots migrate north. They're one of the few birds that heads north in the winter rather than south in the winter for us. Rhinoceros auklets, always around. Beautiful birds, and if you can get a breeding individual with that horn, you can see why they call them rhinoceros auklets. The real coveted alcids where we live are small murrelets that come from the south, the scripses, Guadalupe, and crevaries. The top one on the left with white around the face is a Guadalupe. The one on the right is the scripses, which is the most regular. And that one below on the left is the crevaries. It has the pointy stick-up tail. They're hard to identify, hard to find. Crevaries sometimes for years will not be found in the US. If the water's not warm enough, they won't get this far north. They'll just stay in Mexico. Other years, they become actually quite regular and common, especially in San Diego and sometimes right up to where we are. But scripses is the most regular that we can see. I won't get too far into the Jaegers because you could spend hours on Jaegers. Suffice to say that when they're in breeding plumage, they're really easy to identify. When they're not, they're really hard to identify. And there's classic stories of a Jaeger flying over, especially before the era of digital photography, where you could sort of zoom up on the picture, where that individual was called 3 different species. And there are only 3 species of Jaegers on Earth. So that gives you an idea. The small one is long-tailed, the medium one is parasitic, the large one is Pomeranian. And they're arranged here in small, medium to large. Later in the season, the big Jaeger relative, the South Polar skua can be seen. Sometimes we'll see multiples in a day. We can see up to 5 or 6 in a day. That's a super day, but they're so, we can go several trips without seeing any, but they're always a fun bird to see offshore. And specifically because they breed in the Antarctic. They're one of the few species that we see here that breed in the Antarctic. And there's, in fact, some South Polar skuas that breed well into the Antarctic. And these birds here track from King George Island. I think this is really cool in that some individuals go and winter in the Atlantic, some winter in the Pacific. That's really odd. So, you know, a pair could mate and, you know, they get back to the nest and says, how was your winter, honey? Well, you know, things were really hot in Hawaii. Well, things were not that good in, you know, the Grand Banks. But it's totally different part of the world that they go to from this southern hemisphere breeding area. We have the gulls and terns. Of course, there's going to be gulls that you see close to shore, western gulls, California gulls, and as you get further offshore, some of those remain with you, but then there are others that only you see offshore, like later on in the season, winter, the kittiwake, black-legged kittiwake down here on the right. And for us, a common tern is actually a pelagic bird. I know that, you know, you live in the Great Lakes elsewhere and, you know, Saskatchewan or what have you, and you might be able to see common terns as a common breeding bird in summer. For us, we only see them offshore. They don't come close to shore. They become a pelagic bird here. Now, Sabin's gulls with their bright white pattern on the wings are always a favorite, and we can see them in the hundreds sometimes, depending on the year. Arctic tern, which moves south in the same period of time that the long-tailed Jaegers move south, as well as the common terns and some of the Sabin's gulls. Late August, early September is a good time for them. And they're the birds that have the longest migration of any birds on Earth. These are birds in the Atlantic, not the Pacific, but they head down from the Arctic all the way to the Antarctic. And if you consider the fact that they're really long-lived species, and in a 30-year lifespan of doing these long trips, it all adds up to an individual bird going back and forth to the moon 3 times in its lifetime. That's how much movement these birds do. So they're pretty cool, these seabirds. Real issue we have offshore is separating common versus Arctic tern. You might have this issue elsewhere on land someplace, but imagine trying to do this from a moving boat. Things have really changed with digital photography, ability to capture pictures, look in the screen and say, yep, you know, it's a common versus it's an Arctic. We've learned a lot, and we've learned how to identify things by eye more readily by using the camera as sort of a way to confirm what we're seeing out there. Other pelagic birds, you know, these are not pelagic birds. The brown pelican and the pelagic cormorant, in fact, even though it's called pelagic, it is not a pelagic bird. You hardly ever see them further than a mile or two from shore. So it's one of the most misnamed birds that we have in North America, the pelagic cormorant. The phalaropes, there's 2 of the phalarope species that are common offshore. The red, which is the big bulky one with a thick bill, and red neck that tends to have more pattern on the back, is thinner, thin-billed. And in spring, we can actually see them when we do May trips in breeding plumage. The phalaropes, the females, are brighter colored than the males in breeding season. They're also bigger. Just a little story about the Shetland island, you know, in Scotland, redneck phalaropes, that they were tagged with you know, these data loggers that you can, you know, once you get the bird back, you can download the data and see where it's been. And one of the most amazing things that, you know, has come out in bird migration is that these birds from the Shetland Islands actually fly over to the American side, to Canada, move south, and then cross to winter in the Pacific. So they actually cross somewhere in Central America and winter inside of the Galapagos Islands, and then move back to Scotland. So they're not wintering in the Atlantic at all. Why? Probably food. Probably that's a really good place to eat. Things in the last 10 years or so have really changed in California in terms of the distribution of warm water species. Boobies are now regular. Brown boobies, like this is one of the types that breeds in Mexico, the Brewster's brown booby with the white heads and the males. The first sign of oddity that we had was in 2013 when we began seeing this warm water blob, what they call now a marine heat wave that lasted for several years. And we suddenly had masses of blue-footed boobies coming north towards us. We eventually had brown boobies, red-footed boobies. Now Nazca boobies have become regularly seen throughout, especially in Southern California. And it's really shifted things. Years ago, if a brown booby showed up in our area, you know, people would drive in from everywhere to see a brown booby. Now you can see multiple birds on a boat trip. It's really changed due to changing water temperatures. When we're out there too, we see whales. Humpback whales, the most common. I've mentioned blue whales, and sometimes we can see those shows um, of whales feeding, you know, lunge feeding, doing all of that crazy stuff that you think you only can see on TV. Well, we can see it out there as we've, you know, gone birding and whale watching. It just is all around can be a fantastic outing if all things go well. And we take pictures of the whales' flukes and send that information into Happy Whale. I've had a lot of our whales identified elsewhere in California, Mexico. So that's interesting to take part in. And multiple other marine mammals, sometimes even, you know, sea turtles we'll see, you know, leatherbacks or sharks. You just never know what you're going to see that day. The northern right whale dolphin's a fantastic animal down low on the left there. It's a little skinny little dolphin without a dorsal fin. It's just fantastic. Killer whales will show up at times. We, in our part of California, we're part of the offshore marine reserve sanctuaries. And one of the things that happens is that we are not allowed to chum in these areas for birds. That may change in the future, but on the whole, it's a good thing we have these reserves and these situations that are keeping the wildlife there, but a little bit more difficult for us that we can't chum. Morro Bay down south, we are allowed to chum. I'll end up with a couple of stories and the things about biology and conservation of seabirds. And one of the things is, how do these birds find their food? They smell for their food. They're actually smelling for something called dimethyl sulfide, which is a similar chemical that you get in Brussels sprouts, believe it or not, or, you know, kimchi. So they're smelling for this. It's a breakdown product of when there's a lot of food in the water, and they just sort of meander, getting to higher densities of this chemical until they find their food. So it's not that different from vultures that can smell, you know, their food. And I wanted to tell you about an interesting situation that's happened over time down in Chile. So this photo on the left of this dead storm petrel was a bird I picked up on the side of the highway in 1998 that had down on it in November, and it was inland. And this kind of thing had been happening for years, people finding mummified birds inland of Markham storm petrel as well as hornbeam storm petrel. And the thought was, there were two camps. Some people thought these were storm-blown birds that, you know, or lights or something had messed them up and they were going inland because of this. Other people, including myself, thought they're nesting inland. They're nesting in the desert, in the middle of the desert. And some years ago, probably at this point, must be six years ago or so, I received an email from two biologists who were doing a survey in the desert, and it said at night, they had these birds that seemed to be nightjars. They're flying around at night. And they had recorded the sound, and I realized those are storm petrels. Those are probably Markham storm petrels. And I gave the information to all of my colleagues at the Red de Observadores de Aves in Chile, the ROC. And the folks at the ROC decided to go and try to find these birds. They went to the same spot, and they indeed found that there were storm petrels in the area. And they analyzed what the place looked like, started using Google Earth and other resources to find similar looking places. And little by little, they actually found colonies of Markham storm petrels in the middle of the desert where there's no rain. Like, you can see what it looks like there. There's nothing. And that's part of the beauty of it. There are no predators in these areas. This is from an article that was done on the project. And one of the things that, if you've ever held a storm petrel in your hand, they have a really distinctive musty smell. It's half bird, half fish, something, but it's distinctive. And they would go around the desert finding holes in the right areas and smelling, like dropping down their knees and smelling the hole to see if there was potentially a storm petrel in there. And now they've trained dogs to do it, but this is how they found the colonies, and some of them, you know, really big colonies. And the holy grail was to find hornbeam storm petrel out in the desert, and it was done a couple of years ago. They finally found the colonies of hornbeam storm petrel, one of the most beautiful seabirds on Earth, and it is in the middle of the desert out there. And they're not in the same places as Markham storm petrels, the dark ones. They're in different spots. And there's also the Elliott storm petrel that's breeding out in these areas as well. And as we move forward, we now have a theory that some other storm petrels related to Wilson's are breeding in the high Andes, probably above Santiago, perhaps 2,000 meters above sea level in the mountains. We think that's where they're breeding. Now that seems nuts today, but it seemed nuts a few years ago that storm petrels were breeding in the desert. Now we know it's true. So next step is to see if we can figure out about the birds up in the Andes. A little bit about smell. One of the odd, you know, in Alaska, if you go to some of these alcid colonies, crested auklets, whiskered auklets, they smell like tangerines. And the reason is a chemical called octalol that the birds are attracted to. And the stronger the smell of their mate, the more likely they will actually form a pair bond. So they're using smell as an attractant, sort of the same way as you can use a fancy plume. But it also seems that this chemical decreases the chance that they're going to be infested with ticks and other bugs. So there's a benefit to it. The first I ever heard of this is that you can be on a boat, going towards these colonies, and you smell the tangerines of the birds. And that, to me, was like, wow, that's neat. I'll end with one little story about one of the most amazing things that ever happened to me as a sort of seabirder. Now, I've been involved in Birds of Chile, wrote the book Birds of Chile. I was born in Chile. And so I do these trips, a couple of trips a year. One of the things we sometimes do is we go on a ferry to the island of Chiloé to go see penguins amongst, and other birds, wet-wets and so forth. That picture of the penguins, actually, if you look at them, there's two species right there, Magellanic and Humboldt penguin. It's one of the few places where you can see both nesting together. So we go on the ferry, which is a very short ferry, and I was there with my colleague, Ricardo Matus, and we saw these Wilson storm petrels. We sometimes would see Wilson storm petrels there. And we saw these things go by. And after we've shown them to the group, Ricardo said, "Did you look at those things?" And I said, "Yeah, they were weird." And what we looked at was the fact that there was so much white on the upper wing, and there was sort of this odd contrasting look to them. And he said, "You know what? They had white on the belly, but that you shouldn't have white on the belly. See, Wilson storm petrel here on the left has a dark belly, and Elliott's from farther north has a pale belly. And you couldn't see Elliott's there because well, they don't get that far south." Then what happened is a group of Irish and American birders who were going on a boat trip just weeks later went out and saw these same things with the white belly and sent me pictures. And I'm sitting there receiving these emails, and I show Ricardo and I said, "Look at this thing." And he said, "That's what we saw with that white belly." And at that moment, we realized this is something different. There's something different going on. These are not Wilson storm petrels. And Peter Harrison, known for a seabird guide, he had seen these things too. And he put together a team to go and try to find them and write something up on them. And in the end, this is what, this is a photograph of one of them. He was able to get a lot of information, and we published a paper that described a new species of storm petrel for the world called Pincoya storm petrel, which was one of the most exciting things I've been involved in. And currently, with other colleagues in Chile, we're doing a genetic study to actually see where Pincoya fits in the whole Wilson storm petrel situation. And it's interesting. I'll leave it at that. And people ask me, what's the name? What does Pincoya mean? Pincoya is a goddess of that part of the world. She's like a mythical woman that comes out of the ocean to dances on the water like a storm petrel and tells you, if you're a fisherman, whether the fishing's going to be good or bad, depending on whether she's looking at you or not looking at you. So that's the story of finding a brand new species of storm petrel. And I'll tell you, so we're finding things in the desert, new species are showing up, distributions of birds are changing, taxonomy. There are so many mysteries that are still out there, especially relating to seabirds. A lot of people think, you've got to go to, the Amazon or the mountains of Peru to find oddities and figure something out that is brand new. But the ocean is where we have a lot of mysteries that are still out there. And well, wanted to thank you. Hopefully you enjoyed that sort of run through a bit on pelagic birds. And we're hoping to restart pelagic trips as soon as we can. We still don't know how it'll work, what the regulations will be. We have dates at alvarosadventures.com if you look for boat trips starting in July. And we'll see if that's possible, if we're gonna have to decrease the number of people on the boat or how it's gonna work. We're all in this brand new world, so we don't know exactly how it's gonna be, but I can tell you this much, pelagic trips will happen again. It's just how we're going to do them. And next year I have all sorts of birding trips, happening. Please visit our site if you want birds and wine, Chile, Argentina, Bhutan, Spain, Galapagos, etc. But thanks, Kowa, for inviting me, and also for your amazing binoculars and scopes that have really helped me to actually see these birds. So it's great. Thanks. Hey, you back?
Trying to. There you go. There was a delay. I kept double clicking it. Yeah, so we've got a number of really good questions. Maybe, Alvaro, if you want to stop sharing the screen,
Yeah.
your pretty face filling the screen here, I'll relay some of those to you. The first one that came through was, is there any reasoning for why these seabirds are congregating along West coasts on both continents? Is there any thought towards that?
Yeah. It's actually due to the way that the marine currents and wind go. So those areas of having the cold water currents that come towards from the poles to the lower latitudes, and that aspect, as well as the winds, the specific winds that create the upwelling, happen on that side of the continent due to sort of how the circulation cells go in the ocean. So, if you go to the other side of the continent, you will get warm water that's coming down south, usually, or, you have a completely different situation, sort of like the Gulf Stream. I should say warm water going north rather than cold water going south, like the Gulf Stream in the Pacific, the Atlantic. So different, but good as well.
Perfect. No, that was good. How about, we had one, any thought on specific sunglasses or any other thought towards that? Do you recommend them, use them? What do you like?
That's a good question, because I don't use sunglasses because they mess up with my color perception. And a lot of birders have that problem. We should be using sunglasses to take care of our eyes and the whole thing. And as you know, and some of the fishing people have they're really into sunglasses, the fishing folks. And there's some big time good sunglasses that they go out with, but there's also sort of like a brand slash what's cool, what's not cool, that I don't understand that, but they definitely have some good glass and good protective ability. So you might want to go to the fishing folks to figure out, what sunglasses, but I avoid them just because of the color thing. I don't know.
You have to relearn how to identify birds. I've had the same problem with sunglasses. Like I forget it, and it's an interesting question. I don't know how it would work. You'd have to obviously get close for lights to work, but have you ever considered a nighttime pelagic? I suppose you could chum and get birds coming in on lights, but
we've considered doing long trips where we start out at night so that we we pass through the shallower water at night, and then when it, daybreak, we're in the deep water. Some of the tuna fishing expeditions do that kind of thing, and I've been on tuna boats, and it's cool. In the East Coast, that's a lot more sort of the norm when you're in the sort of Northeast, but we're not used to it in California. The deep water is not that far out, so it might just be something to think about. Yeah, we're thinking about it. I think if things hadn't gone so haywire this year, we probably would be trying it this year, but we don't know. We don't want to, we don't know what to offer yet.
Right.
Given what the complexities may or may not be. Who knows? I mean,
The reality to see in the birds. Yeah. So I answered this to a degree on a broader scale for California based on eBird, but what time of year is best for the sooties at Half Moon Bay in particular?
It's usually late July to mid-August. That's when the biggest numbers tend to be close to shore. But it varies, and it's year to year. Some years they don't show up. Or well, they don't show up close to shore. They always show up. They're
following the food.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about a suggestion for field guides, books for pelagic birding? Do you have any favorites there?
Yeah. There are these actually two small little booklets that Steve Howell and Brian Sullivan have created, one for the East Coast, one for the West Coast. I forget if it's just called Pelagic Wildlife, but Steve Howell, Brian Sullivan, and they're small, easy to carry, have great photos, and both of those folks are experts, and they put together something that's easy, and it doesn't have to be this huge tome, But of course, there are huge tomes that are, really good as well. But if you just want to have like a reference for the motel and, the trip itself, those are really good.
Okay. Here's another one here. We've had a couple asking about how far inland are the Markhams and Hornby's petrels breeding colonies.
I want to say that the one that's furthest inland is something that's over 100 kilometers inland. Well inland. Chile's not that thick wide to begin with, so you're limited. But one of the colonies I visited was probably 20 miles inland, and it's ironically about a mile from the main highway. Once it's there, it's like, how did anybody ever miss this? But of course, the birds come in at night. You're not expecting to have anything going on, ocean bird going into the desert. And unless you're there at the right time, right place, right time of year, you're never going to know they're there. So, but yeah.
Okay, how about this one? Where would you expect that the Pincoya storm petrel breeds?
I think they actually breed in the mountains. They're not, I don't think they breed on islands. If they did, we would know about it because there's a ton of fishing in that area. I think people would have figured it out that there's a colony of seabirds. Just the local fishermen. I mean, you could probably go and do a survey of the local fishermen, and none of them say there's little birds breeding on these islands. So my guess is they're in the mountains.
Right.
Call me crazy.
Okay, you're crazy. That's why I love you, man. It's like, kindred spirit. Okay, there's a couple different questions on the same one, broader, one more specific. One person's asked about, climate effects and changes in populations, and specifically, someone's wrote that I've heard that there's less food in the Arctic for shearwaters that has led to die-offs. Can you talk about how climate change may affect the lives of pelagic birds?
That's a huge question.
Right.
Huge
Loaded.
question. So the way that the ocean is warming is so complex that people don't yet understand how it's happening. So that marine heat wave we had, the blob of several years, Um, People think that's associated with global climate change. It's also correlated with the California drought. It's also correlated with those situations when the Northeast gets the super cold winters. You know, it's all correlated. But what's the original cause? Is it, you know, shifts in ocean temperatures or what it is? It's unclear. But food is decreasing, and it goes in spurts, and it's not consistent. So you will get a die-off of Cassin's auklets one year. That's just massive. They do well the next year. We have a die-off of common murres happen one year. Last year, short-tailed shearwaters had a really bad die-off. These die-offs have happened throughout history, but what's happening now is that they're bigger, and there's die-offs that are more consistent. And we're having it correlated with issues like gray whales not getting enough food in the Arctic, so that some individuals aren't making the migration back and forth successfully. But you have to counter that with the fact that the gray whale populations are now higher than they have been since whaling. So we have way more gray whales than we did 40 years ago. We have way more humpback whales in California than we did 40 years ago. So there's good and bad. The question is, are we in a transition point to something really negative, or are we just going to have these variations and oddities and stuff that birds might be able to ride because these are long-lived birds? We had 3 years where Heermann's gulls did not breed in Baja. If they had not bred for 5 years, that would be really problematic. But 3 years they can handle. So they're long-lived birds, so we're lucky in that respect. If you were dealing with these kinds of fluctuations and you were talking about short-lived birds, they'd be up the creek. Seabirds are a little bit more resilient. So that blob thing, though, that was so scary to live through, where everything was just shifted. Everything was odd, fish that never been seen here. And it's just like, what is going on? And then things kind of reverted to sort of more normal. Now we're complacent a little bit. But if the blob comes back, then what? I don't know. So I don't know how to answer that other than something's going on.
Working on it.
Yeah.
Learning more daily. It's just like your mysterious storm petrel.
Yeah.
One more from Facebook over here. Someone's asking specifically, which one of the booby species is the rarest one to see in California?
Which one of that? I guess, that's shifting now. Yeah, Northern Gannet, actually. There's one.
Yeah.
And if anybody was wondering what that's about, there's one individual Northern Gannet that's been living in California for several, probably about 10 years almost. And so there's one bird. It's actually not hard to see. If you live here, you can kind of, it's got its patterns, but that's pretty rare, one bird.
Yeah.
Nazca booby historically was the one that, it only was accepted to the California checklist a few years ago, but now it seems to be more common than mass booby. So if you look longer term, Nazca booby would be the rare one, but in fact, I would say that currently, mass booby might be the rarest. And red-footed booby is the other one that, has been historically rare, but we had, so many records recently that that's shifted too.
Right.
Definitely brown booby is the most regular. Yeah.
All right. And then I guess a couple, that seems to be it for questions. We'll wrap that up, but I do want to mention a couple other things. People have mentioned it throughout. Will this be available after the fact? Once again, this is being concurrently live streamed on Facebook, and it will live on the Facebook page for Time and Optics, but also we will post this onto our YouTube channel for Kowa Sporting Optics. So that's youtube.com/users/Kowa Sporting Optics. And you can link to that off of our Kowa Sporting Optics Facebook page as well. You'll see it. This is a personal question, but how about optics? What optics do you like to use on your pelagics?
So as you know, Jeff, there's like there's an issue of like some people, the power issue,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So people have tried to convince me that I should not use a 10 power binocular because my angle, field of view is too
Yeah.
narrow and so forth. But I've never had a problem using a 10 power binocular,
Right.
and my hands don't shake. And so for me, I would use a 10 power binocular. I
You're a
mean,
10 guy.
I'm that guy.
Yeah.
These guys, are doing it for me on the pelagics everywhere.
Even
But
10.5. You're a
yeah,
stud.
yeah, yeah, I forgot about the half.
Yeah.
That's sort of saying, I'm 5'1.5",
A little bit more.
yeah.
All
But
right.
anyway, I think that a lot of let's not say beginner birders, a lot of birders, most birders would rather not have a 10 power binocular on a boat because they want a wider field of view, less shaking. But it becomes a personal thing. I do like a heavier binocular that I can, sort of really hold steady. I don't know about you, but sometimes a smaller binocular for
Yeah.
me is harder to hold steady. So
Yeah, agreed.
I
I
don't know,
mean, there's nothing to anchor them
yeah,
in place. They're kind of
yeah.
bouncing
So
around.
what do
Yeah.
you think? What would be your, thought?
I've never been man enough to hold a 10. I'm a shaky individual, depending on, I'm unstable. So take that
Yeah,
as you will. So I've always been the guy with 7s and 8 powers, and a sucker for field of view, but it's all good. Um, I guess with that, we'll one more time remind everyone that you can, if you're going to be buying some optics, this is an opportunity to visit timeandoptics.com. You can support um, conservation and the Black Swamp Bird Observatory. If you are, one of the folks that go to the biggest week religiously and enjoy that, the biggest week is an opportunity. They'll be given 5% back of every optic sold to the folks there at the Black Swamp Bird Observatory. And I think we have covered it all. Alvaro, thanks for your time, man. It's good to see you virtually, if not in person. Look forward to the latter soon. Hopefully we can maybe do a Kowa boat trip.
yeah, that would be, once we get things going. I would also like to say, well, thanks to you guys for putting these together, these series of talks, and that it's weird to give a talk to no audience, but I appreciated the chat kind of things scrolling by. I couldn't read them all, but I appreciated all those people who sort of said things because it makes you realize that people really are out there. Well, that's great to know. And everybody take care out there, right? Keep safe, healthy, and try to be go outside, look at some birds, get yourself out of the zone of worry. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's good mental health. And yeah,
Yeah.
you had uh, triple digit viewers from, I don't know how many countries exactly, but I know we had people pre-registered from over 10 countries.
Oh, wow.
So, and you knocked it out of the park. It was really interesting information. So overall, thanks again. Thanks to our friends at Time and Optics and the biggest week in American birding. Thanks to our friends at Optics for Birding, who I see checked in your close to your neck of the woods there, Al, not too far away in Irvine. Um, so thanks again, all. Look forward to seeing you at our next event, which will be next Saturday at noon. We're doing a digiscoping deep dive with Simon Brunby, one of the best digiscopers in the world. All
Wow.
right, folks. Checking out. Thanks again.